Great, great. Okay, should I go? Should I start?
It's all
I'm
you.
Nate. All right, I'm Nate from Hiyu Wine Farm. And so Hiyu is a 30-acre farm in the Columbia River Gorge that's focused on um, sort of using principles for like natural farming, permaculture, biodynamics, to sort of create like a holistic, integrated sort of system for living, for making for making wine and like growing food, and caring for plants and animals and people and all sorts of beings. And then, so in addition to Hiyu, which is a 30-acre farm with 14 acres of vines, with like all the critters and many different grape varieties, we also farm um, 4 other sites sort of across the gorge where we're doing sort of similar things.
And who's your doggy?
My dog Chef, she said hi. Now she's gonna sleep. She's a Great Pyrenees that has lots of dreadlocks because she's never had a bath.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, since you've now introduced the projects, maybe go into detail about those, the various winery farm projects,
Yeah.
environmental, social, whatever direction you want to
Yeah.
take it.
Yeah. So it's four. So architect. We're located in the gorge, and so it's maybe important to say something about that first. And so the gorge is sort of an hour east of Portland, and it's sort of an interesting zone that lies east to west along the Columbia, between the rainforest and the desert, and north to south it's between Mount Adams and Mount Hood, between these 2 cascade volcanoes that are 60 miles apart. So I always think about it as being this like box that's like about 40 miles wide and about 60 miles long, that goes from sea level to 11,000 feet in that space, and sort of spans any sort of climate that you can possibly imagine. And so it's a bit of like a play from a winemaking perspective. It's like a little bit of a playground because you can grow any grape variety that exists and make any wine style that you can imagine, with the caveat that it's all volcanic. So there's no limestone or granite or any of those other sort of soil types. But so it's the climate and sort of the shape of the topography and things that are sort of shaping things, and sort of wind and water and all those things. It's not really like it's homogenous from the perspective of soil, and we've sort of embraced that and everyone tends to do that here. So like if you look at everyone who's sort of making wine here tends to farm their own. So they tend to farm their own vineyards. So you don't see a lot of purchased fruit, like in most regions in North America, especially on the West Coast, you see a separation between farming and winemaking. And you'll see like the same wine, you'll see this wine from the same vineyard, like say Shea, for instance. You'll see like 10 million Shea Pinots made by every single winery, and all the farming is by Dick Shea, and all the winemaking is sort of separate. And that's pretty much like what defines, sort of West Coast like viticulture and winemaking. The gorge doesn't really allow for that for various reasons. And so you see a lot of, so if you're looking at like Analemma or Savage Grace or this new project Lorelei that's emerging, like everyone sort of, if you want to do something here, it needs to be this project where you're doing both farming and winemaking and doing the whole thing, because those other structures like don't exist for it. So sort of say that. And then everyone tends to grow a lot of different grape varieties because of the diversity that we're talking about. And so we work really partners with like 7 or 8 sites, directly farming, and any given instant 5 or 6 sites, across that whole range of climate that we discussed. But like we work with 150 different grape varieties, but it's pretty common for wineries in the gorge to be working from between 12 and 50 grapes. Like it seems crazy, but it's totally normal here. And so we're expanded out beyond that because of the field blends, but that's sort of the other thing that happens here. And so So at Hiyu, there are 112 different grape varieties, and every single wine is based on giving life to a really small parcel on the land. And so the wines are named after the parcels. So if you look at like um, Aura is like a 3/4 of an acre parcel um, that's like basically co-planted Pinot Noir and Pinot Gris. But if you look at like Corvus, this is a 1/2 acre parcel that's based on grapes you would find along the Camino del Santiago. But they're individual places that we bottle every single year. And Hiyu, there's 16 of these parcels, which are the 16 Hiyu wines. And for Zoom, like with the Anya, it's like all 15 of the grape varieties from Chateauneuf-du-Pape that are interplanted, but primarily Grenache. This parcel is a little shy of an acre and a site we farm in the desert. For Zoom, it's the same thing. So like Hiyu is all the wine from the farm. And then Zoom, which means to market or locate in Chinook jargon, which is the language from the fur trade, are single parcel wines from the other site. And then Floreal Cider is the cider project, which is our collaboration with the biodynamic orchard on Mount Hood to make fruit wines from everything growing in their property. So mostly right now, apple, pear, and quince, but there's also like, you know, elderberry, blackberry, and plum, and like all sorts of other stuff that you'll see coming in the future as we sort of flesh that out. You know, but between these, like Floreal is it's right on the mountain at 2,000 feet. And so like, I mean, wickedly sort of, yeah, cold, intense, you know, kind of mountainous place, colder than almost anywhere you would think about making, you know, sort of wine if we think it's like sort of like classical regions. And then where the Anya is, it's, you know, it's 5 to 10 inches of rain a year, blistering, like sort of hot in the summer, super windy. I mean, it's, you know, Southern Mediterranean climate. So you have this huge, yeah, span of sort of climates and sort of flavor possibilities sort of built on that.
Not to get too far off topic here, but how much of a soilist are you? I mean, you talked a bit about the predominance of the volcanic. How much do you feel that soil?
Yeah, it's like a really good question. I mean, so for us, we're mostly focused on like on living stuff. So more on like the organic side of terroir, not the inorganic side of terroir. And so we're mostly interested in the way that all the different life forms connect to each other. So how are like plants, animals, mushrooms, bacteria, and people sort of relating to each other in the wine sphere, and how do those different sort of beings support each other, and how do they work together to sort of create what we experience on the human end is sort of like, you know, human culture and like human food. How is that sort supported by fungal and like bacterial culture, and vice versa? How do our activities sort of support those things, and where do the animals sort of get involved in that, and how do our decisions about sort of, yeah, about lifestyle impact the flavors that can emerge from that kind of system? That's mostly what we're interested in. And so like the growing medium, it is what it is, and it, you know, it has like sort of an impact, but it's more this like sort of, that's like sort of in a lot of ways, it's like it's like the sort of fundamental layer is like the sort of the climate and geology is what everything's playing off against. But the really significant part about what you do has to do with the living sort of creatures on the site. And so the part of the soils, it's that thing that's sort of like in the background that's sort of connecting everything. But the part where the real sort of magic and interesting stuff happens is at the level of like the life forms, basically. And that's the part that you want to actually that's where the decisions that we make a difference. And that's where wines become unique, is on the level of the life forms, not on the level of that sort of substrate that's in the background.
Now, with that in mind, you've introduced some of the labels as well now at this point. Can you paint the picture of some of these properties that, you know, Hiyu that you farm and reside on, and then some of the others that you farm?
Yeah, so at Hiyu, totally. Yeah, so at Hiyu, because we live here, it's where it's like the highest density of sort of life like diversity of life of anywhere that we're working with. And so it's we're in the Hood River Valley, which is an alpine orchard valley. And it's sort of interesting. I mean, we're basically, we're 22 miles from Mount Hood. The Hood River is like right below us. So it's like a high gradient, like sort of alpine river. And then we're just surrounded by sort of really destructive sort of agricultural processes that we're trying to be hopefully a force to like sort of change them. So you have like a lot of timber, a lot of commercial timber in the hills above us, and then we really have like conventional pear orchards are like most of our neighbors, and we've adopted this and so those are like monocultures of sort of tree farms, and pears. And so we've sort of adopted this opposite principle where they're pigs and cows and ducks and chickens and guinea hens that sort of work with us. So there's no mowing and tilling. All the animals sort of help us to do kind of all the work that they're doing, including like they're really important for like the fertility and like sort of nutrient cycling, kind of all that. And then there's like tons of different plants that are growing amongst the vines, like on the site. So 40 plus different legumes and like grasses and flowers and perennials and annuals, all sorts of like different things, like fennel and like all sorts of things are sort of growing out amongst the vines. And sort of the diversity of those plants that are growing and the way we just sort of stay out of the system from like a management of like those plants sort of standpoint, the way there's this sort of symbiosis between sort of what's happening with the animals and the plants there. And sort of domesticated animals then end up attracting like sort of wild animals to the site. And so this, as does sort of the interesting process I would like to describe here is this sort of like what happens, when you're not mowing and tilling, is you get, roots grow deeper as the plant grows higher into the air. And then as the plant flowers, you're sort of attracting like different pollinators. And then as that structure of the plant hardens and goes to seed, that's kind of creating a home for different insects. And then birds start to become attracted to those seed heads and to those insects. And so these like smaller creatures and these larger creatures gradually just start like feeding each other. And you have this sort of cascade of life that just kind of increases. And then the bacteria and fungal network is sort of getting driven by a lot of those actions of like the larger, like sort of biological life forms. And then that connects into the cellar. And so we're sort of using it. It's a probiotic spray program instead of an eradication-based spray program that's based on, like typically an organic vineyard and biodynamic vineyards even, they'd be spraying mostly sulfur and paraffin oil, which is petroleum derived, to sort of eradicate different pests, so both insects and different fungal things. But because we don't want to harm the insects and sort of the bacteria and fungi that are on site, we spray mostly like fermented teas that sort of create herbal competition. So that's like this end thing that then like tries into a cellar environment that is really based on the same principles where like when we harvest, we harvest by hand in small baskets, we go directly in the fermenter without sorting so that we're preserving everything that was coming in like from the vineyard. Our cleaning protocols just based on water. For the most part, we try to leave the cellars undisturbed as possible so that all the different yeast and bacteria that are responsible for the fermentation process and various fermentations, first, second, third fermentation, like all these sort of things, like are able to basically adapt themselves over time to the site and to the wines. And then with the wines themselves, we sort of, there's no sulfur in the crusher, there's no sulfur in barrel, so that all those organisms are allowed to sort of stabilize the wine like kind of over time. And so there's this connection between all the life that's happening in the vineyard environment and how that's based on a sort of minimal touching kind of situation, and what's happening in the cellar, which is also based on a real minimalist like kind of protocol.
If I remember correctly, you mentioned that the site itself, the farm, had been, prior to you taking it over, had been farmed organically, as long as you can recall.
Yeah, that was correct. It was like one of the original organic. So both the place where the cider's from, and so this is like the oldest organic orchard in the Pacific Northwest. But our property was an organic pear orchard, was started at the same time. So there were a number of families came up from California in the 60s and 70s, and they brought organic practices to the Hood River Valley. And so this farm was one of those original families, and the cider property, the Jacobsons, was one of the other. There were really only four. It was like sort of four farms in the Hood River Valley that are traditionally organic. And so this site is organic. But one thing we'd like to talk about is that it's not so much about, like for us, it's not about like chasing purity. It's more about remediation. It's more about trying to like adopt practices that'll help to like heal things that are broken more than, so like for instance, if you're a winery and you want to go into like this like pristine like oak savanna and like take out all the trees so that you can plant a vineyard there in this place that's never been like disturbed, like to me that's really problematic. And so you might have the purest wine in the world that's like sort of surrounded by forest, but in the act of ripping out that woodland, you really did something that you really shouldn't have been doing, which of course is happening en masse, like in the Willamette Valley, and has been happening for a really long time in California. And so our preference would be that people would go into places that are already sort of beat up and torn up and sort of work in those places. And just sort of understand that we're really beyond the place as a society and as like a sort of human world where we should be concerned about sort of purity, though it doesn't really exist, like, and where it does exist, it's often problematic. And so anyway, so
as you've taken the farm down the path of, what you just described with the teeming animal and plant life and this recovery process, what are some sort of top level points that you've been able to kind of take away from this process over the last?
I mean, I think one of the things is worth like saying that like we're really young, and so these processes, really unfold over decades, and we purchased 7 acres on the west side of this farm in 2010. And then the core of the property is like 20 acres. We didn't purchase it until 2015. And so a lot of the changes are really kind of new. And so, yeah, we definitely notice, an increase in sort of just life on sort of like every kind of level. And then also the plants are gradually more resilient and more sort of resistant to disease on their own without sort of, needing more help from our part. And that the wines, every single year sort of, the fermentations proceed in like a less sort of troubled way. And the wines, everything just sort of feels like sort of more calm and more serene with the wines as sort of time goes by. But I still think it's like really early to like, really make big, to really like understand like what's going on, more sort of just sort of feeling it and experiencing it.
Take us to some of the other maybe closer farms, Atavus perhaps, or Moon Hill, or some of these other places
yes, Atavus is the few properties have been really important for sort of our evolution and for like I think people understanding the gorge. And so Atavus is a vineyard that was planted in the 60s on a ridge above White Salmon, Washington. So it was planted at the same time in the first Willamette vineyards were being planted, but in Washington, but at like triple the elevation. So it's at 1,800 feet. the highest vineyard in the land for the longest time was Temperance at around, it's like, I think the top of Temperance is like 850 or something. And that was considered just like out there, like totally wild. And so I think it's important to say with Atavus first, like how crazy it was that they thought it was okay to plant that high. And I think for a lot of that vineyard's existence, it was really marginal because of that elevation. And then as global warming has set in, we've had major changes, in the climate in the gorge in terms of when things are ripening. That site is really in an optimal position to kind of ripen. And so, yeah, very prescient of then the plant. And then south facing, that site is surrounded by forests. So surrounded by tens of thousands of acres of forest, looks right down the Columbia, looks right at the Hood River, but it's actually more influenced by Mount Adams that you can't see from the site that's closer to it. And it's old volcanic clay. And the recent history of that property started in 2010. So Stephen and Chris from Analemma came to the gorge at the same time as we did. And they started leasing that site as sort of their entry into like making wine in the gorge. And at that point, the vineyard was sort of in a state of disrepair, almost abandoned. And so Stephen renovated it and introduced the biodynamic practices to the site. So Stephen had been the viticulturist and assistant winemaker at Cayuse, so been responsible for a lot of the farming and sort of BD practices there. So he sort of brought a bunch of that to Atavus and started making these, super beautiful sparkling wines, and rosés, and Gewürztraminers, and the whole thing. And we made our first 2 vintages of wine at Analemma in 2013, 2014. And so we started buying a small amount of Gewürztraminer from Stephen and Pinot Noir to make the wine that is now Atavus, like the Atavus White, which is the Solera based on Gewürztraminer and Pinot Noir from the upper field there. And then we took over the farming from Stephen in 2017 and started to sell like fruit back to him. And so we started working with just like a small amount of Gewürz and Pinot. And now we make sparkling wine from the lower hill, dessert wine from the middle hill, Pinot Noir from the upper hill, and then the Solera still from a portion of the upper hill where the Gewürz and Pinot are planted side by side. But it's a super magical, special place. Vines are spaced super wide, 12 by 7. Lots of beautiful mushrooms. And it's amazing. And the wines, I would say about Atavus is the wines are both, the elevation gives the wines wines are very vertical because of the elevation, but it's perfectly like exposed and south facing. So, and it's further east than Hiyu. So it's actually in a drier part of the gorge, but colder because of the elevation. And so it can be warmer there in moments. And so the wines have a lot of amplitude. Like they're quite rich. Like the wines from Hiyu and Atavus are, of all the sites we work with, probably the closest in that both sites produce wines that have a lot of intensity, where the wines are both, they're very concentrated, they're very dense, they're very long. Whereas the others, there's some sites that are more delicate, and some sites so the other major site we work with is called Scorched Earth, and it's in the desert. So it's 30 miles east of us, right on the banks of the Columbia. There are no trees there. There's tons of sagebrush and desert plants. It's decomposed basalt sand, and it's far warmer than here. And we have over 50 different varieties planted there. They're mostly Mediterranean varieties, and the climate is really closest to Santorini or some sort of Mediterranean island, where you have these really black volcanic soils, tons of wind, a lot of heat, and it's very exposed, and you're on the water, so the Columbia almost functions like the ocean there. And you actually can smell the Pacific, as it comes up the gorge. You can smell the salt on the air. But so the interesting thing to say about Scorched Earth is that it's warmer, And so you can ripen things that you couldn't ripen at Atavus or Hiyu, but the wines are more delicate. And so the Scorched Earth wines tend to be relatively pale in color and extremely gentle. And so they're like very like sort of soft, billowing, almost like cloud-like textures, where the wines at Hiyu and Atavus are much more, there's they're much more dense and sort of like, and so it's a weird thing where you have the colder climate sites actually produce more concentrated wines than the warmer site, which is, I think, the inverse of what people sort of normally sort of think about or like understand, that sort of thing. So it's interesting.
Yeah, ripe and heat equals
Concentration, which it really does.
Right? But
Yeah.
it's not.
Yeah, they're really not correlated. But people sort of assume they're correlated, because concentration isn't. It's not actually color. It's not actually. It's more sort of a deeper kind of extract. It's like this. So there's one of the important principles in wine, right? Is like people. It's again this sort of fundamental versus significance things. So people get really fixated on alcohol, acidity, tannin, pH, and like all that stuff. That's like the least important thing in wine, right? So if you go to the grocery store, you could grab some bottle of like $12, like crazy mass-produced Pinot off the grocery store shelf. You could send that to a lab. It could look the same as a bottle of Latoche. The wines have nothing in common, right? Like, so if you're at all focusing on any of those things, like it's like a total red herring. Like it's completely distracting you from what's important about the wine, because what's interesting about the wine has nothing to do with those numbers, right? Like, and so, and often the same thing about like, yeah, really obvious things about the like really obvious things about a wine's color, or like that's not the essence of the wine. The important stuff about the wine lies on the levels beyond.
Would you say that the next important property would be the Mount Hood Organic Farm site?
Yeah, for sure. Like, I mean, for us, like the core, like I'd say like Hiyu's the core, and then sort of Scorched Earth and Mount Hood Organic Farms are sort of the other places that are really closest to us, and they're opposite in terms of climates. And so the Mount Hood Organic Farms is, it's basically on the lower slopes of Mount Hood at 2,200 feet in the Upper Valley in Parkdale. It's the last agricultural property. It's basically the first farm you reach as you come down from the mountain, and the last one, as you're heading up onto the mountain. And it's right on the east fork of the Hood. And the property actually it's a mile of waterfront on the Hood, and then it lies on the slopes above that. It's 250 acres, of which most is wildlife and wilderness. And then there's a 50-acre biodynamic orchard that's planted at high density. So it's meter by 10 spacing. And so it's grown actually like vines. So the trees are very close together. And we met the Jacobsons at the farmers market in Hood River in like 2012, and tasted the apples, and we're just like totally blown away by the intensity and the flavor and all those things. And at that moment, we were really interested in sort of figuring out a different way to sort of situate the relationship between sort of growers and producers so that they were more deeply connected. So typically, when people are buying grapes or apples for cider or grapes for wine, the grower doesn't make any money. Like, so typically like the grower sort of like farms, they sell the fruit for this sort of like break even thing, and all the money is made sort of much later at the sale of the wine. The grower doesn't see any of that. And because of that, in that system, there's sort of a false sense, like the sense like value isn't like attributed sort of properly. And so the grower doesn't get enough money to really take care of their property or to put back the inputs or the care into the ground that needs to happen. And so the winery is able to make like a profit, but it's because they're not accounting for everything that needs to happen on the farming end. And so both kind of sides are just letting this sort of like base commercialism sort of drive the reaction and not so much the needs of like the land or the plants. And so when we set up the project for Floreal, we set it up as a partnership in which we both they take care of the farming and sort of growing the apples, we take care of the production, and then we share all the other costs, and then we split the profits 50-50. And in that sense, like it just feels more like a real partnership where we're both really completely invested, in the project and what happens, and we're able to sort of give back to the land and everyone that's sort of working on both of the projects in a way that's way more meaningful than if you just have these like totally dissociated sort of grower producer relationships. And the idea eventually is that if it works out, you could form more of these sort of like symbiotic sort of grower producer relationships where you could have, like, frequently, if you look at, you have a lot of like really young, talented winemakers who can't afford land. And then you have a lot of growers who don't really know what to do with their land that they own. And if you can couple those people in a really thoughtful way, then you could get some really interesting sort of results that are sort of more meaningful than the way those relationships are kind of like set up today. And so that was it's sort of like an incubator for sort of sorting that thing out. So if we could eventually go to other growers in the Hood River Valley and say like, hey, if you stop growing these conventional pears, your business could look like this. And, and you get set up with this person, and these are all the changes that happen on the farming side. And this is, how we'll diversify what you're doing so that you're not dependent on the capricious nature of like, Walmart as the buyer for all your pears or like whatever. And so it's based on that was sort of the principle behind the relationship.
Is it realistic? I mean, is that the most realistic model, do you think, going forward for, and we were speaking about the gorge specifically, but is there, is it realistic for winemakers that want to move to the gorge to set up shop? I mean, is that even an option right now there, or is it not? Is it such a high barrier to entry with the way that land is, priced or rationed, or the size of the parcels and that sort of thing?
Actually, the gorge is one of the places where you are seeing, it depends where in the gorge, like, real estate varies sort of in different like parts. Mark, and there are some like really reasonable places you can do stuff in, like Yuri, who owns the White Salmon Bakery, is doing a cool project on a really, sort of organic scale. And Bethany Kimmel from Color Collector is sort of, getting her project up and going in Snowden. So there are like niches, but I do think that different cooperatives and like collaborative relationships, that it's possible to set those up in a more thoughtful way to make it possible to like really expand the scale of things. And so I think like the best practice is, to sort of set up, places like in town where, everyone can have like sort of shared cellar space, and then they can have, restaurants and tasting room where they can be sort of creative, like on that end with like food and wine. And then where they can sort of help all these growers who have land but are sort of struggling with how to use it, to sort of bring health back to that land and sort of more diversity like to those business models. And I do think that that's the best sort of way going forward, is to sort of sort of pair. And generally see like here there's a real like aging population in the orchards, and they have a lot of like kids like don't want to take over, and sort of pairing those people with sort of people who are really excited about the production and farming, but can't get there. The barrier to entry is really, it is really capital intensive. And so there are creative ways to get through that. And so, yeah, I think it's the future, the way forward.
Cool. Well, since you were just talking about the Floreal property, maybe it's a good time to launch into the labels themselves. Maybe start with Floreal and
Yeah.
give us the inspiration behind the labels. I know China's not here to talk about her drawings, but they're so beautiful.
Yeah, so this is Floreal, and it was the first cider we made for the property. And so eventually there will be, 5 or 6 different ciders, but for now there's this cider, which is based on very intense dessert apples, crab apples, pear, and quince. And so it's a high sugar, high acid, aromatically intense cider, but not a cider built on tannin, like per se. And so these are all apples that, like, if you look at an apple in the grocery store, like a Fuji or a Honeycrisp, like that sort of thing, those are low intensity apples. So those are low sugar, low acid, low flavor. Traditional dessert apples, like an Ashmead's kernel or a golden russet, they call them dessert apples because that used to be dessert, back in England in like the, a few hundred years ago. Anywhere from like, especially like high Middle Ages to 1800s. That was kind of like before there was like ice cream and stuff. That was like big dessert game. Those apples have high sugar, high acidity, and tons of flavor. We don't really eat them anymore. They make also incredible cider, and so Floreal is based on that. The big base to understand about Floreal is that it's nothing is added to the cider except for the fruit. It's aged, pressed and basket pressed, aged in barrel for a year, and then it's not bottled off the first fermentation, it's bottled off the second fermentation. And it's a wild fermentation that is initiated in bottle with fermenting cider from the subsequent vintage. Which is, that second part is really unusual, but it allows for a full year of élevage, and for the wine to go completely stable in barrel and develop additional complexity. But then the second fermentations produce a much more desirable sort of mousse than a first fermentation. So that's why you see bottles of Pet Nat like jump out of bottles all the time. It's because the kind of bubbles that you get off that first fermentation are really aggressive. And so this method allows a secondary fermentation where you get a much more beautiful texture, carries the aromas in a more thoughtful way, but without having to add sugar or yeast, which is like what you would add like in almost all champagne and kind of most other traditional methods, sparkling methods. And so the big advantage of that is that where you add that sugar in champagne, it creates almost like a flavor hole, So you're like, when you drink champagne, there's always this part of it that is wonderful. And then there's always this sort of layer of like shallowness. And so using the juice allows you to avoid that kind of sort of like, it's like sort of like a sugar gap. And so that's the big thing, the production in general. Eventually we'll work on ciders that are based on crab apples and bitter sharps and pink ciders and perries, and like more of like ciders that resemble orange wines with really long maceration. So eventually there'll be other things. And then there are a bunch of like mixed fruit wines coming that have like grapes and apples and berries and stuff.
Is that the hedgerow?
Yeah, well, that's different. So there's the first wine is Espina, and that's a hedgerow wine that it basically has pears and grapes, grape skins, rose hips, elderberry, hawthorn berries, and then it has like carbonically macerated whole plums and blackberries. That's like, it's coming.
Yeah. Amazing. We've actually noticed that, I mean, really what you described is a fruit pet nat. And I think.
And they're not pet nats though.
Oh, the Floreal.
Second fermentation.
Yeah. What's next? What do you think the
Yeah,
Zoom or the Hiyu? What would you
yeah.
like?
So there's a tiny amount of Atavus 5 around, right? Which is the latest incarnation of the Solera. So it's the Gewürz Pinot from the upper hill at Atavus, directly pressed, and then there's some maceration sometimes. It's 13 through 19 in this bottling. Basically, it's held in a battery of 600-liter puncheons. They're not really puncheons, they're like 600-liter ovals. And then we bottle 150 liters by hand directly from each of the ovals. And then we'll replace that with the next vintage. And so this is the latest thing. It's the most complete. And it's the first one where you really, I think, feel the older wine in it. And so it has, eventually this wine will resemble like an Oloroso sherry. But that'll probably take another, 10 or 15 years for that to really take shape, but you're just feeling just the beginnings of some like the other releases of this are beautiful, but you wouldn't be able to tell that they were Soleras per se. But this one's the first one where you really, there's this sort of, deep kind of amber, kind of cool stuff going on. And not nutty, but just, more layers. So it's Atavus 5.
And so 5 is just your expression of the wine being a Solera 5th edition.
Yeah, it's the number of the bottling. And so instead of, because it's multi-vintage, we can't put the vintage on it. And same with Floreal. So Floreal has bottling numbers on it, because you're not allowed to use a vintage for cider.
And what are the vintages or harvests within the Atavus?
13 through 19. I think for that.
What's your approach for any of the Solera wines you make in terms of the winery? How do you move wines?
You sort of leave the one. Yeah. So I mean, in the beginning, we have to let a few vintages sort of like stack or layer. And so in the case of Floreal, the first release was 13, 14, 15. So those just sort of hung out for a while. And then we rack them together, barrel them down, and that sort of starts the Solera. And now that it's more established, it's at like it's about 2,200 liters or something. Now we just come directly out of each individual barrel and replace it with young wine. And so we're no longer sort of using a racking process, but a process that more resembles sort of what would happen in sherry. Mm-hmm. So we're never completely removing all the wine out of the barrel. And there's definitely something special. We try to do it whenever possible to bottle by hand directly from the barrel and not to rack before bottling. And sometimes it's possible, sometimes, it depends on the wine, but. So there's no pumps used in the winery. And we try to avoid stainless steel as much as possible. And so that's sort of part of that like protocol. And it basically enhances textures because the use of pumps is really bad for the motion of the wine. If any winery ever uses a bottling truck, you can't bottle by gravity with a bottling truck. Most wineries use bottling trucks. And so that's like that. It's like a major thing.
And when would you use stainless steel?
Yeah, if we just for like a few days, if we have to, rack multiple barrels together prior to bottling, then we'll use stainless for that. We try to just have the wine in the stainless for as little as possible. Because it's not inert, like it actually affects the flavor of the wine. And in a way, like the wines, they sort of lose some of if they're in stainless for a long time, and certainly if they're like fermented in stainless, it's really a problem. But the edges of the wines sharpen, and so the wine loses some of like this sort of beautiful rounded edge. So if you imagine like a hobbit cave with like round doors. Your wine's more like that. If you keep your wine in like amphora or wood, and like a stainless steel is more like a square door, which is it's like suboptimal.
That's a great.
It's very biodynamic too. Like it's very Waldorf, right? Like this very Steinery, you know.
And moving on to the other Zoom wines, the new releases, they're from different sites from Atavus, correct?
No, so Zoom, the Zoom Atavus 5, and then there's Zoom, and then there's the Atavus Red, which is the Old Vine Pinot from there, which is super, super spicy, extremely rich. Pinot from that site with a 2-year élevage, all whole cluster, all fermented in conical wood and foot tread. And then there's the Zoom, there's the Elder, which is also, this is Pinot from a site that we've been farming since 2016 in the East Hills of Hood River. So it's like sort of iron-rich volcanic clay with basalt cobbles, south facing, that also produces pretty dark, meaty Pinot. So like really more Chablis Chambertin if you're like making those illusions, or can like at moments like, so the spring ephemeral Pinot has traditionally come from this site, from the flatter parts of the site. This is this like 1.5 acres at the central hill that produces the most intense fruit. But that wine in certain vintages would almost taste like Cote Rôtie. Like if you taste the 16 vintage, like it can be very like Rhônish. And so sometimes you have those Burgundies that sort of, you know, sometimes like Cote Rôtie tastes a little like Burgundy, sometimes Burgundy tastes like Cote Rôtie. And this is one of those sites that it's like dark and very textural and quite tannic. So it's extremely like, and spicy, you know, very dark, powerful, dry. And it has this like 3-dimensional texture. So it's like a lot of richness, but tannins have like some grip and power.
When I think of Elder, I think of like someone with some gravitas. That's the connection.
Yeah, and it's actually named, I mean, it's the name of the road that's above the vineyard, but it's also, we're thinking a lot of just elderberries because they're wild trees sort of all over the place around there. But
so not the Elder, but
not the elder, but yeah. But you know, it has all the meanings.
So take us out of your area with the other Zoom.
Yeah, and so then there's Anya, which is the has all of the great varieties from Châteauneuf-du-Pape, and that's about 15% of the field, and then the rest is Grenache. And so it's, yeah, sort of like, I mean, one of the Grenache is really amazing on that site, and we in the sort of process of sort of figuring out how to work on that site, we introduced all these other varieties to sort of bring a little bit more, yeah, sort of complexity and layers and support to the varietal, and just so it wouldn't be quite, I think when you have like the monovarietal wines, they're very clear, like in terms of like, this is the grape, but they're often like less complex. And so we prefer, again, like sort of all those different like flavors on the periphery and the biodiversity. And so the Anya produces that. This is from a part of the site that is, it's like, it's a little amphitheater and it's surrounded by basalt monoliths, and kind of looks down on these sand dunes and then the river. And so it's sort of the core of the site, like this, the center of that sort of property. And then, you know, it's whole cluster fermented, open top wood, foot tread, just super, super traditional vinification, basket pressed into old puncheons, and then a full 2-year élevage. So this is the first time we sort of attempted, we released some spring ephemeral Grenaches from pure Grenache from younger vines on the site. And so this is the first time they were sort of able to do sort of kind of full élevage and sort of treatment. So compared to those wines, it's a little less fruity and a little more like savory, meaty, spicy. And it's sort of richer and more layered than sort of those spring ephemeral Grenaches were. So there's a lot more, yeah, sort of depth and things kind of happening. It's like really like, yeah, a lot of like, yeah, like cumin and dried herbs. And so amazing for like Mediterranean, like sort of food. Kefta, it's good.
Hmm. And would you say Lunasa also is in that camp of Mediterranean?
Yeah, so like Lunasa to me almost, it's Syrah Grenache, but to me this almost tastes more, almost always more like a Southern Italian red. So like is not like, I wouldn't call it like particularly Syrah-esque, but it's like much darker and denser and like really wild. And like so this wine has a lot of like smoked meat and like petrol.
So
And like,
Aglianico.
yeah, like wild mint. Like to me, like sometimes reminds me of Palo Bayas wines, but also sometimes reminds me of Tarazi. Um, and it has like a cool, like there's always a bit of like a really interesting like browning, almost like oxidative kind of note. And so the wine has, it's like got the darkness from the Syrah, but a bit of oranging in the rim usually. So it's almost like somewhere in between of like if you're like crossing like like old vine Syrahs with like a Tarazi or something, you know? So it's like more in that like sort of like vibe feel um and like quite, yeah, smoky, meaty, dark, savory, herbal, intense. Like we always pour this wine last. It's sort of the um yeah, it's deep. It's quite deep.
And
And
then
it's
bring
also all whole cluster, 2 years, and like big barrels. Like, yeah.
bring us
Whereas
back.
Hiyu, sorry,
Sorry.
like bro, Hiyu, you like Crataegus is the Syrah based wine in Hiyu. That tastes much more like a Côte Rôtie. You know, it tastes more like crossing like Savoie with Côte Rôtie with like Tyrol to go. But like the feel is more like the Northern Rhone here, and out in Scorched Earth, it's way more something from the south. Like,
And then take us back to Hayu with the Aura, Corvus, and Moondog, and then we'll go into questions.
yeah, so this is 17 Aura, which is an amazing place right now. And this is, so I say in general, like the wines benefit from the 15s and 16s are just really like coming into themselves, and the 17s beginning to crack open and I think being an interesting place. And so if anyone ever asks, the wines will age for really like quite a long time. Like it's just the beginning of the windows. And so this is Pinot Noir and Pinot Gris equal parts. That's an essential hill on the farm. It's like right above the wine tavern, and it's they're picked together. They spend 8 days on the skins, all whole cluster, and then they were in 300. It was in 300 and 400 liter barrels for about 20 months. And this is a pretty deep wine. So this has, it's very textural, but also extremely vertical. So it has a lot of extract. So it's like very, a lot of richness, a lot of length. It's way more mineral savory than it is fruity. And so there are fruit notes, like there, you know, there's like, yeah, like bitter grapefruit and like some peach that's like hiding in there and some cherry and like all that stuff. But it's really like, so it has a bit of like what we call like noble reductions, like that sort of Koche Merceau kind of like white Burgundy reduction on the nose, so a bit flinty, smoky, and then yeah, wild herbs and just a lot of like sort of mineral like extract. And so yeah, super dense, deep, layered, and it's like kind of pink to salmon colored. So we call it a white wine because to me it drinks like a white wine, but it, you know, pink orange, orangish. So it's really cool. And this is an amazing place. Like, so I think of all the wines, the 217s and the 16 are really like drinking the most, you know, like totally complete right now.
That's the Corvus 17 and the Aura 17?
Correct. And I mean, it's a pretty good set. And like 16 Moondog also is like that. 17 Corvus is the wine that's based on the Camino de Santiago. And so we always think about Cabernet Franc as having its origins in the right bank Porto and the Loire Valley. It's purportedly from an abbey in the Basque country of northern Spain called Roncesvalles, which is also the beginning of the Camino de Santiago. And so this wine is sort of based on those Basque origins of Cabernet Franc. And there's like sort of 2 points of inspiration that are interesting here. And so the Cabernet Franc cuttings are from Vieux Chateau Certain, which is sort of the most massive and dense and kind of like old school Pomerol producers. And this wine definitely does, there's sort of like a Pomerol thing where at lower alcohols, the wines are still like, they have this like just crazy, like dark, chocolatey sort of core. This wine has that, which is really, really cool. It also has like really beautiful mint aromas, but then it's co-planted with Menthia, Aboriou, Manseng Noir, and Brancholat. So grapes you'd encounter in the southwest of France and along the Camino, some grapes from Galicia. And those bring this like more like floral, delicate, like sort of periphery to the wine. And the Menthia can often taste, like Rhônish, like, it has like the wines are peppery. And like sometimes you're tasting Menthia, they taste like Crozes Hermitage. Sometimes these are the good ones. We're not talking about like the Menthias from Biertha that taste like, like nothing, or like Cabernet. Like these are like the Menthias, like high altitude Ribera Sacra, where I get really peppery and all these things. And so this does that and almost takes it in this like almost Cornos direction. And so like there are moments when this wine reminds me of a wine like Vieux Chateau Certain, and then other moments where it's almost like Allemand Cornos. And the wine sort of like cycles back and forth between those things. And this spent 50 days on the skins and 3 years in barrel. And so the wine is massive. And so it's a really good example of like power from a cool site that's not coming from picking ripe or from extractive winemaking, but that's just like totally internal to like the site architecture. So it's really exciting. It's powerful. Like, yeah, lovely. And then the last Hiyu wine is Moondog. And so this is, it's a little amphitheater, like a little bowl. It's in the bottom of the central hill. It's next to Aura, so they're adjacent. And this has like many clones, like, over 30 clones of heirloom Pinot Noir, mostly from California. So like, different iterations of like Swan Pinot and like Mount Eden and Calera and all those sorts of things that produce sort of longer, brighter wines that are typical from Dijon clones, which usually produce sort of like really fruity, kind of fat, short wines. You can tell I love Dijon clones. But then also has Pinot Gris, Aligoté, Chardonnay, and Pinot Blanc. So, and that's probably like between 8 and 12% of the total. We don't ever like really know for sure. And it's, again, it's like made very traditionally. So it's like whole clustered open top wooden bats, untouched for the first 4 or 5 days. And then once the fermentation begins within the berries, we'll gently tread by foot once a day. And this saw significant post-fermentation maceration. So it's about 30 days on the skins. So very close to the way, like, say, like Dujac was making wine like the 80s or something. And then the fermenters lifted up with a forklift. We siphon into the barrels by gravity, pressed in a small ratchet press, and we mix the press sort of in the free run. And this was in 2 350-liter, so like small demi-mudes in a way. So thick staves, smaller barrels, but old for full 2 years. And then this is a current release, so it was aged for a further 2 years before release. And it's just very, deep, spicy, resonant, sort of Pinot-driven wine. Fun to drink with alongside really fancy Grand Cru Burgundy.
Thanks for ripping through all those wines for us. Now, speaking of drinking. Are you open right now to the public?
Yeah, we're open Thursday through Sunday, and there are 3 different experiences. And so we offer a tasting of 6 wines paired with 6 snacks in the afternoons from like 2:30 to 5. And then we have it's like a very convivial sort of family style lunch from noon to 2 that is also served with 6 wines. And then we offer a dinner that sort of combines those experiences that's sort of available to book every night around 6:30. And that's so it has some of those small courses leading up to, you know, some like sort of family style courses that often like would like be about like the beef we raise on the farm is what we've been serving lately, that sort of thing. Yeah, and so we're doing like all that stuff. And since everyone listening to the call is in industry, we like let us know if you're coming to those. We offer a 30% industry discount for sort of any of those, you know, kind of experiences. If you're out and about in the gorge and want, you know, a beautiful lunch and like that sort of thing, we'd like love to host everyone.
4 hours door to door, Seattle to.
It's easy.
Yeah, no problem.
Yeah, no problem. The beautiful weather is coming, so it's exciting.
Well, let's open up to questions. Trini, I think you have control over the mic. There was first there was a question coming from Robert Gomez, and then the second one was actually a question coming from his alter ego, not Robert Gomez, who I think has left us. So maybe we'll start with you, Robert, and then anyone else who wants to chime in. Trin, can you adjust these mics here, because I have no power. I'm powerless.
Yeah, I've unmuted everyone, Luke.
It looks like they're all muted.
Well, people can they can unmute.
Oh, so they have to unmute themselves, right?
Just Robert.
Hi, Robert.
Oh, hi. Yeah, sorry.
The first question, I'm really curious.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah. Do you know who your alter ego is?
Okay. Yeah. So I actually talked to Trini about this. I wanted to share the link because I had some people that wanted to join in, and so I did, and then my name was on there. But yeah, that's my buddy who's also here in Walla Walla with me. But yeah, so that's his question, the original. So I think it's a good question. I'd love to hear your answer, but I didn't actually ask it, so I apologize for that.
Can you restate the questions?
So the question here is, since everything we do is intentional and destructive, even if we can do amazing work to replenish, our choices affect the environment around us. By choosing to even maintain a vineyard is still prohibiting that site from becoming woodland again. At what scale can we justify?
All this stuff, like all that sort of stuff, like sort of comes from this Western dichotomy that believes in the separation between nature and culture. And so it sort of believes that there's this sort of like pure state of nature that's like separated from sort of what man does. And like in this sense, like the modern environmental movement and sort of the forces that are destroying the environment are really like 2 sides of the same coin. And so what we're really interested in is it's sort of best expressed by a concept in permaculture called like zone 4 permaculture. So in permaculture, zone 0 is the zone right outside your house. And zone 5 would be theoretically like pure nature. The idea is that like that zone 5 isn't real. Like that doesn't exist and never existed. And that zone 4 is the zone where sort of human beings are like fulfilling their proper role in the ecosystem to support the sort of plants and animals that surround them. And so you have this really like subtle interface between a man and nature. And so what you're looking for is not a farm, which is a cultivated system, and not nature, which is really a system, like for the most part, like all of our natural places are falling apart, right? Like if you like, and it's because they're actually not getting enough attention and enough care. And then because humans aren't playing the role that they need to, like in the ecosystem. And so like paradoxically, when environmentalists and the environmental movement tries to keep human beings out of natural areas, they're really doing the work of, they're doing the same sort of thing that, like, so say in the Hood River Valley, the logging groups and the orchardists and the environmental groups are often aligned on the same issues because they want people out of the valley. The logging groups want people out of the valley because they don't want people seeing what they're doing. The orchardists, the same thing. Like, they're spraying tons of chemicals, like they're like huge liabilities, right? But the environmental groups want people out too. If all of a sudden people come in, then the logging groups have attention on what they're doing, the orchards have attention on what they're doing, and there's sort of more visibility and there's more care. And so, like, ultimately what you want is more people who have like a stake in, who understand like what trees need, what plants need, what animals need. And you only get that when you're like in contact. And so with like zone 4 permaculture is what existed when North America, whatever, when the rest of the world was like colonized by Europeans in the 1500s, they thought they were coming into nature, but they weren't. They were coming into land that was being very carefully managed by indigenous populations to both be very healthy and to support those cultures. And so this idea that man is destructive and that nature is pure ultimately is really problematic for sort of both people. And what we should be looking at is, instead of having our food kind of cordoned off in like these places that we call farms, and then we can't see what's going on, you really want food to be everywhere and not to be able to tell the difference between zones that are for food, zones that are landscape, and zones that are nature. It should all be, you know, sort of thoughtfully like interwoven like into our lives. And the technology as well, like using technology in a really smart way to get like the best result sort of inside that system.
Thank you. Robert, that do it?
Oh, yeah, that was a yeah, it was a really great answer. Thank you.
Who else is next? Who's up?
I have a question.
Hi, Liz.
Hi, hello. Hi, Nate.
Hi, how are you?
I'm great. How are you? Thank you for joining us.
Good to see you.
Good to see you too. I have a question about global warming and animals on the farm, and then also about Scorched Earth.
Yeah.
You had mentioned that it's very much like, you mentioned Santorini. And I was wondering, did you choose all the varieties to plant in that area? And have you found some grapes? Have you planted Sertico, for example? And have you found the vines to act like they do on volcanic islands, where they create nests and when you allow them to grow naturally?
Yeah. So right now we're not. So we have Santorini. We have a Sertico planted on 3 sites right now in the gorge.
Mm-hmm.
So we have some at Elder, and some at Hiyu, and some at Scorched Earth. And mostly because we found it does really, really well here. And so it's one of the varieties we're most excited about. And yeah, like, so what we basically saw was that so originally Scorched Earth was planted to Grenache Syrah Zinfandel, and we've been grafting. But the Grenache, the wines tasted really similar to Canary Island wines, is what we were sort of seeing from the initial taste from other varieties. And then so we gradually have moved over to planting some based on Southern Italy, some sort of Southern Italian cultivars, some Sardinian sort of like base planting, some Canary Island sort of things, and then also playing around with Greek things. So the Sertico and Roditis, and Mavro and Leotico. But yeah, and the wines don't necessarily like taste like those wines per se, but it's just really close, where you have the volcano that's providing sort of like soil substrate. You have a lot of wind, you have a lot of heat, but then you also have coolness coming from the mountain. And so yeah, we find similarities in different moments with the Etna, with Mount Tied, but also sort of what's happening in the Cyclades.
Fantastic. When will some of those grapes are you already are they ready to harvest, or are they still young? At what stage are they? Like, when were they planted?
So we planted Sirtico for the first time at Hiyu. That parcel was grafted in 2017, and the first vintage was 2018. That wine's called Hypericum. And we currently produce a pretty tiny amount. So it's been somewhere between 1 and 2 barrels. It's really small. We grafted an acre at Scorched Earth of a Sirtico Roditas and Southern Italian varieties last year. So this year will be the first full vintage, and there should be about 100 cases. So that'll be a wine that actually gets out in the world a little bit more. And then we have 2 acres of Sirtico that's pure at Elder. And this will be the first vintage for that wine. There should be a few hundred cases. And so I think that'll be pretty exciting, and should be, something that, like with the Hypericum right now, it's such a tiny amount that it's like, it's amazing, but like it doesn't, it's not able to really get out there so much. So.
That's exciting. The other question I have is, in your time there, you mentioned global warming. What have you seen? What have your observations been with the animals? Have you seen new animals come in, or herbs? And have you seen anything move out, or, anything naturally growing that you hadn't seen, a year ago or a couple years ago?
It's a good question. On that front, we definitely saw like this huge difference, like in ripening, right? Where it used to be that Pinot Noir was harvested historically in this property. We're about the earliest it had ever been harvested prior to 2012 was October 15th. And now we harvested about a month earlier. And so that's sort of like, it's a pretty intense level of change in that regard. In terms of things growing here, we really haven't been here. We see a lot of different plants and animals cycling through, but I don't think we've really been here long enough to see what that pattern is related to. And so different plants activate during different years, but I don't think that's necessarily warmth related. I think that it's things that we can't it's part of patterns that I don't think I really understand, why certain plants are more prevalent in some years than other. And the same with the animal cycles. It's really hard to say why we see one species of animals or bird or something and not another at this point.
Interesting. Thank you.
Only another decade or 2 before you figure it out, right?
Yeah, I mean,
or not.
That's hard to.
Any other questions for Nate before we wrap up? Well, I guess you'll just have to visit. We'll come down and eat some food, drink some wine.
Yeah, that'd be amazing. Yeah, it's really exciting for people to be coming back. And I think we have our first industry group coming with a distributor from Colorado at the end of April. So that's a big change and really exciting. So hopefully we'll see Seattle group here sometime soon.
For sure. Well, thank you so much for taking time to talk through the projects and the wines today. And we'll see you down at the winery.
Okay, amazing. Yeah, thanks for listening, everyone. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Nate.
Have a great week. Thanks, Nate.
Thank you, guys.
Robert.